It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, the kind you don't remember because nothing remarkable happens. I stepped into my garage, keys in hand, ready to take out my car for a quiet drive. The sun was steady, the air calm, and then it happened. A scream, sharp enough to slice through the stillness, erupted from across the street. It wasn't the scream of fear or pain. No, it was the kind of scream born from rage and desperation, the kind that makes you freeze because you know chaos has just been unleashed. Karen, the neighborhood's self-appointed queen of rules, the tyrant of the HOA, had locked her eyes on me and my garage. Within seconds, she was shouting wild accusations, her voice cracking the quiet suburb into pieces. And then came the words that turned a simple moment into a neighborhood spectacle. She claimed my car wasn't mine at all, that I had stolen it, that I had ripped it straight from her driveway, from her life, from her wallet. Before I could even process the insanity of it, she was on her phone, dialing 911, her shrill voice dripping with false panic. The neighborhood, once silent, turned into a stage. Curtains pulled back, eyes peeking from blinds, cameras lifted from porches. And there I stood, framed by the shadows of my own garage, accused of grand theft in the very place where I kept what I had worked for. My car wasn't just a vehicle, it was now a weapon in her war, and she was about to use it to try to destroy me. To understand the madness that unfolded that day, you need to know one thing. Karen was never just another neighbor. From the moment I moved into that quiet cul-de-sac, she had crowned herself the ruler of the block, armed with HOA bylaws and an ego bigger than the houses she policed. She wasn't elected, she wasn't chosen. She simply decided the neighborhood was her kingdom, and everyone else was a subject. The way you cut your grass, the color you painted your door, even how long your car sat in the driveway, nothing escaped her hawk-like eyes. And if she didn't like what she saw, you'd hear about it. Letters in the mailbox, notes slipped under doors, sometimes even a public announcement at the mailbox cluster, as if she were addressing her court. Most neighbors ignored her. Some tried to appease her, but me? I learned quickly that Karen didn't want compliance. She wanted control. And the more you resisted, the more relentless she became. It wasn't about the rules, it was about her power. And in her eyes, I was the one neighbor who dared not to bow. Every project I did, every change I made, she twisted into a violation. My house was my sanctuary, but to her, it was enemy territory. That's why the garage mattered. That space wasn't just concrete and storage, it was mine, untouchable, a part of my home she couldn't infiltrate. And maybe that's why, the moment she saw me open it that afternoon, her obsession finally boiled over. To Karen, the garage wasn't a door lifting. It was a challenge, a spotlight on the one thing she couldn't control. And that was enough for her to turn ordinary life into pure war. It started so ordinary you wouldn't have thought twice about it. A warm afternoon, the sun dipping just enough to cast long shadows across the driveways. Neighbors walking their dogs, sprinklers ticking rhythmically in the distance. I walked out to my garage, remote in hand, ready to grab a few tools and maybe dust off the car I'd been working on. Nothing dramatic, just another day in the suburbs. But to Karen, every move I made was theater, and she was the self-appointed critic. The moment the garage door rattled open, I felt her eyes on me, burning from across the street. And then I saw it, the tightening of her jaw, the way her phone appeared, in her hand like a weapon, her gaze locked on the car parked inside. To her, that car wasn't just mine, it was hers. Or at least, that's what her twisted story would soon become. She marched closer, heels clicking on the pavement, her voice already rising, demanding answers no one owed her. "Where did you get that car?" she spat, as though she were a detective exposing a thief. Neighbors began peeking out, curtains twitching, heads turning. The ordinary quiet of the neighborhood was suddenly electric with tension. I stood there, calm, silent, but inside I knew this wasn't about a car. This was about Karen's crumbling empire, her desperate need to prove she was still the queen of control. And in that moment, as her voice cracked with fury, she crossed the invisible line from nosy neighbor to something far more dangerous. What she didn't know yet was that opening my garage had just opened a war she could never win. Some neighbors whisper. Some complain under their breath. But then there are people like Karen, who treat every inconvenience like a declaration of war. She wasn't just angry about the garage, she was obsessed. Her voice grew sharper, louder, designed to draw a crowd, and that's exactly what she got. Phones came out, cameras rolled, and the entire street watched her unravel like a live show. She jabbed her finger toward the car, shouting about how it had been stolen, how she had just purchased it, how I was apparently some thief who had rolled it into my garage overnight. The absurdity of it was almost laughable, if not for the venom in her tone. Karen wasn't talking to me anymore. She was performing for an audience, painting herself as the righteous victim of a crime that never happened. But there was one flaw in her performance: desperation. It leaked out of every word, every wild gesture, and desperation makes people reckless. Before I could even respond, she was already dialing, her voice dropping into that fake, trembling act, the kind designed to manipulate whoever was on the other end. "Yes, officer, I need help immediately. A man is threatening me. He stole my car." Her words echoed across the cul-de-sac, each lie crafted to sound urgent. Each syllable meant to push me closer to the image of a criminal. The neighbors exchanged uneasy looks, some buying into the act, others finally seeing the cracks. And in that moment, as Karen's voice carried through the speaker, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just a scene anymore. She was calling in the law to finish what she couldn't control on her own. When the first wail of sirens cracked through the quiet suburban air, the crowd that had gathered outside my house stiffened. Phones lowered, whispers died. Karen's smirk widened, the kind of smug grin only someone convinced of their impending victory could wear. She stood straighter, fixing her suit jacket like a general preparing to greet her soldiers. For her, this was the moment the curtain would drop. The finale of her carefully staged drama. Me, dragged out in handcuffs, humiliated in front of the neighbors she ruled with fear. But reality has a way of spoiling bad scripts. 2 patrol cars slid to a stop, red and blue lights flooding the cul-de-sac with a glow that made every face look guilty. The officers stepped out, calm but alert, hands resting close to their belts. Karen wasted no time, rushing forward with frantic hand gestures, her voice rising into an emotional performance so rehearsed it bordered on theater. She pointed at me, at the garage, at the car, her voice cracking in all the right places, dripping with manufactured fear. "That's him. He stole my car. He threatened me. She didn't just want me arrested, she wanted me branded a criminal forever." But the officers didn't move to cuff me. Instead, one of them tilted his head, eyes narrowing as Karen's story spiraled into frantic contradictions. That's when the inspector, clipboard still in hand, stepped forward. He had been silently observing, noting every word, every gesture, and now, his calm, steady voice sliced through Karen's hysteria like a scalpel. "Officers," he said, "before you act, you should see this." He held up documents, proof, statements that painted a very different picture, and just like that, the weight of suspicion shifted. The cops didn't look at me like a thief anymore. They looked at her like a liar caught in her own trap. Cornered animals don't retreat. They thrash, they claw, they try to drag someone down with them. That was Karen now, her empire of intimidation crumbling in real time, and panic twisted into desperation. The officers weren't buying her act. The neighbors weren't nodding along. And the inspector's quiet confidence had stripped her mask clean off. But instead of backing down, she ignited. Her voice shot up another octave, cracking under the weight of her own lies, as she hurled accusation after accusation like grenades in every direction. "He forged the documents. He's dangerous. That's my car. I have the receipt." Her words tangled on each other, contradictory and frantic. But she delivered them with the conviction of a cornered tyrant. She marched toward the garage, jabbing her finger at the vehicle like it was Exhibit A in her grand courtroom. Drama, demanding the officers search it, demanding they put me in cuffs before he escapes. Neighbors flinched at her theatrics, some recording, some whispering, but everyone could feel it. The more she spoke, the more her power evaporated. Every word wasn't saving her, it was exposing her. The inspector's raised brow, the cop's patient silence, the sideways glances from witnesses, all of it was a mirror reflecting back the truth she refused to face. And then, in one final act of arrogance, she pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her bag, waving it wildly, insisting it was her bill of sale. The officer took it, scanned it, and smirked. The date didn't match, the VIN didn't match, nothing matched. Karen had just handed over evidence of her own fraud. She froze, her voice finally betraying the first crack of fear, as if she realized, too late, that the flames she had set weren't burning me. They were devouring her. When the tide turns, it doesn't trickle, it crashes, and Karen was standing right in the path of it. The officers had the so-called bill of sale in their hands, and the smirk spreading across one cop's face was like a death sentence. They began asking questions, not friendly ones, but precise, cutting ones that stripped her excuses bare. Where exactly did you purchase the car? Who was the seller? Why does this VIN number not match? Why is the date scratched out here? Each word was like a scalpel, and every answer Karen offered sounded less like truth and more like a desperate improv act. Her polished tone cracked, her gestures became jerky, her face flushed red with the realization that she had lost control. She stammered, pointed at me, tried to spin new lies on top of old ones, but the officers weren't budging. They leaned in, voices calm but heavy with authority, demanding specifics. The crowd was silent now, hanging on every exchange, phones still rolling. Karen tried to laugh it off, then shifted to rage, then back to tears. In a matter of seconds, but every performance made her look guiltier. One officer held up the fake document again, shaking his head before pulling out a notepad and beginning to write. Karen panicked. This wasn't the reaction she wanted. She rushed forward, insisting they didn't understand, babbling about her HOA authority, about how this man had been a constant problem, about how she was the victim here, but no one was buying it. The more she clawed for credibility, the deeper she sank. Even her body betrayed her. Sweat beading at her temple, hands trembling, voice rising and breaking like glass. When the second officer quietly said, "Ma'am, lying to law enforcement is a crime," the crowd gasped. Karen froze. For the first time all day, her mouth snapped shut, her eyes darting, like a trapped animal looking for an escape that didn't exist. The HOA queen wasn't giving orders anymore. She was facing judgment. The law wasn't bending to her will. There's a moment in every fight when the crowd stops wondering who's right and starts realizing who's already lost. That was the air around us now, thick, electric, and heavy with certainty. The cops weren't just listening anymore. They were dissecting, their tone shifting from polite inquiry to firm control. One officer stepped closer to me, lowering his voice just enough to cut through. "The tension, sir. Do you have proof this vehicle belongs to you?" Without a word, I pulled out the folder I had prepared weeks ago. Title deed, insurance papers, even a photo of me with the car the day I bought it. The officer scanned them, nodded once, and handed them back with something Karen had never given me in all these months: respect. He turned to her, his face blank, but his voice was razor sharp. "Ma'am, can you provide any legal documentation? Anything at all that proves your claim?" Silence. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. The crowd shifted, phones recording every second, eyes fixed on the HOA queen crumbling in real time. She tried again, muttering about being misled by the seller, then quickly pivoting to how I was aggressive and dangerous. But the cops weren't buying it. Not anymore. They looked at me, then back at her, and it was clear where the weight of truth was leaning. The louder she shouted, the smaller she looked. One of the officers even turned slightly, shielding me as if I were the one who needed protection. That's when the crowd murmured, subtle but powerful. The moment neighbors realized I wasn't the troublemaker. I was the victim. And Karen's empire of control had just collapsed in the middle of the street. Under the red and blue lights, she had summoned herself. Cornered animals don't retreat, they lash out, and Karen was no different. Her power, her image, her control were slipping like sand through her fingers, and she knew it. Panic twisted her face into something unrecognizable. The polished HOA tyrant, replaced by a desperate woman clawing at the last shreds of authority. She threw her hands in the air, her voice shrill, cracking with hysteria, as she screamed that the officers were corrupt, that I had paid them off, that the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her. It was chaos wrapped in delusion, and for the first time I saw fear, not in the eyes of the crowd but in hers, because deep down Karen understood what was happening. This wasn't just about a garage door or a car anymore. This was the public unmasking of a bully, and once the mask is gone, there's no putting it back. The officers didn't raise their voices, didn't flinch at her accusations. Instead, they stood like stone pillars, letting her meltdown expose her for what she really was. One officer calmly noted her every word, another radioed something back to dispatch, and the inspector, still standing with his clipboard, watched with a quiet satisfaction that mirrored my own. Karen's voice cracked again, echoing into silence, and that silence was deadly. No neighbors rushed to her defense. No sympathetic nods, no whispers of agreement. Just phones recording, heads shaking, and a neighborhood silently choosing sides. And in that stillness, Karen realized she had lost, not because I had won, but because she had destroyed herself. Her empire of control hadn't been toppled by force. It had collapsed, under the weight of her own lies, crumbling for everyone to see. The sirens faded, but the silence that followed was louder than anything. Karen stood there, her suit disheveled, her face flushed with rage and humiliation, her voice finally broken into trembling fragments. The officers didn't look at me, didn't look at the crowd. They looked at her, and in that single moment the balance shifted completely. One officer stepped forward, his tone calm but sharp, asking her to repeat her accusations. Karen stammered, her words suddenly fragile, stripped of the venom she had tried to wield. The inspector, seizing the moment, handed over the stack of reports, complaints, and violations she had tried so hard to bury. The officer flipped through them, his expression hardening with every page. What Karen had called neighborly disputes now looked like harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power, written in black and white. And the crowd, those very neighbors she had ruled through fear, stood united, nodding, confirming every detail, their voices steady where hers faltered. For years, Karen had been the storm, and we had all bent under it. But now the storm was gone, and she was just one woman drowning in her own lies. When the officer finally asked her to step aside, her legs seemed to betray her. She stumbled, muttering about mistakes and misunderstandings, but no one listened anymore. Phones recorded, pens scribbled, and her empire of control lay in ruins on the pavement. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The law, the evidence, and the people had spoken louder than I ever could, and in that instant, Karen wasn't the HOA president or the neighborhood tyrant. She was just a desperate figure cornered by truth, watching everything she had built collapse in front of her. The squad car door opened with a metallic click that echoed like a verdict across the street. Karen froze, her eyes darting wildly between the officers, the inspector, and the neighbors, who no longer looked at her with fear, but with a quiet, cold satisfaction. She tried one last time to gather her composure, straightening her suit jacket, as if fabric could stitch back the authority she had already lost. "This is a mistake," she snapped, her voice sharp but hollow. "You don't know who I am." But that was the problem. Everyone finally did. The officers weren't moved by her theatrics, weren't impressed by the thin veil of authority she had worn for years. They had evidence, they had witnesses, they had her words, recorded and inconsistent, twisting against her like barbed wire. The inspector, calm and precise, laid out the timeline of harassment, the fines, the false reports, the threats hidden behind official HOA letterhead. Each detail was a nail hammered into the coffin of her credibility. And then came the moment no one thought they'd ever see. The officer read her rights in the middle of the cul-de-sac she had once ruled like a queen, and the sound of it was electric. Phones captured every second. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. Some even applauded. Softly, like a curtain call at the end of a very long and bitter play. Karen's face twisted between fury and disbelief, as if reality itself had betrayed her. She tried to speak, but the clink of handcuffs cut her off. That sound, cold, final, was the end of her reign, and as they led her toward the car, her empire of control collapsed into nothing. More than the faint trail of her heels scraping against the pavement. The street had never felt so quiet, and yet so alive. For years, Karen's presence had been like a shadow draped over every front porch, every mailbox, every painted wall. Even laughter seemed measured when she was around, as if joy itself required her approval. But after the squad car disappeared around the corner, carrying with it the very woman who had thrived on fear, that shadow lifted. Neighbors who once whispered in private now spoke openly, their voices rising in relief. It started small. A woman clapped. A man let out a long breath he didn't know he was holding. A teenager muttered finally, and then it grew. People lingered on their lawns, conversations sparked, eyes met without that old weight of suspicion. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again. The inspector remained a while longer, explaining the legal process ahead, assuring us all that Karen's grip was broken, and her actions would not be swept under the rug. Each word was like a stone laid on a new foundation, firm, steady, permanent. And as dusk settled, porch lights flickered on one by one, not out of habit but out of pride. My garage door, once the battleground of her obsession, stood open without fear, the car inside gleaming under the streetlight as a silent trophy of resistance. I stood there watching, realizing that this wasn't just my victory, it was ours. Karen had ruled through division, and now, in her absence, unity was born. The irony was sharp. In trying to protect her own false sense of power, she had ended up giving the neighborhood back its freedom. And as the night deepened, the silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. It was ours. When I think back on everything, every letter, every threat, every manufactured rule Karen wielded like a weapon, it all seems almost surreal. How could one person cause so much chaos over something as simple as paint or a car parked in a driveway? But that was the truth of Karen. It was never about paint or cars or bylaws. It was about control. And when control became her lifeline, she was willing to burn down the peace of an entire neighborhood just to keep it. But here's the thing about control. It's an illusion. No matter how tightly you grip it, the harder you squeeze, the quicker it slips away. Karen never understood that. And in the end, her downfall wasn't caused by anyone else. It was caused by herself. The lies she told, the power she abused, the enemies she made. They were the bricks of the prison she built with her own hands. And as she sat in the back of that squad car, shouting, denying, unraveling, I realized something important. Bullies don't stop because they want to. They stop because someone stands up and forces them to. That day, I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was standing up for everyone who had been silenced, intimidated, or humiliated by her tyranny. And the neighborhood's quiet smiles, the relief in their eyes, told me it mattered. Karen may never learn the lesson her actions wrote in bold letters, but we did. When you refuse to be broken, when you hold your ground, even the loudest voice of intimidation eventually becomes just an echo, and echoes fade. So, what do we take away from this? That sometimes the loudest, most intimidating voice in the room is nothing more than fear dressed up in confidence. Karen thought she could weaponize rules, neighbors, and even the police against me, but in the end, truth stood taller than all her lies. And that's the thing about stories like these. They remind us that no matter how small you feel in the face of a bully, standing your ground can turn the tide. Now, I want you to think for a moment. Have you ever dealt with a Karen like this? Someone who tried to control, intimidate, or humiliate you just to feel powerful? If yes, tell me in the comments, because trust me, your story might be the one someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. And if you've made it this far, that means you're the kind of person who loves a good story where justice wins and the villain finally meets their match. So do me a favor, hit that like button to show you stand against bullies, subscribe so you never miss the next story, and share this video with a friend who needs a reminder that sometimes karma doesn't knock, it kicks the door down. Because in this channel, we don't just tell stories, we make sure every lesson sticks. Until next time, stay strong, stay bold, and never let anyone write your story for you.